Today is March 8th, 1790. I'm Savannah Good, and this is my co-anchor, Jared Lanier. Today we have a very special news report for our viewers. We would like to recap on the changes Europe has underwent in the past 75 years. First, let's start with the life-changing ideas that were made public by the Enlightenment thinkers in the early 1800s. The philosophies, as they are often referred to as, encourage individual liberties, even for the common people. Some of the ones you may be familiar with are John Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, and Thomas Hobbes. The philosophies also encourage Europeans to question authority and not simply believe what they have been taught their whole lives.
I'm sure you can see how this angered the Pope. These ideas became popular with some of the monarchs of this past century, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. The best known enlightened despots of our time are Frederick the Great of Prussia, Maria Theresa of Austria, Joseph II of Austria, and Catherine the Great of Russia. Before we get into each of these individuals and their accomplishments, let's make sure everyone understands what we mean by the term enlightened despotism. Enlightened despotism enforced the natural, inalienable rights, encouraged art, science, and education, and equally enforced the law. The first enlightened despot we will talk about is Frederick the Great of Prussia, one of the most educated and cultured monarchs of this century. Frederick the Great ruled Prussia from 1740 to 1786. While he is considered an enlightened despot, he still kept some despotic tendencies, a trend that is popular for the other enlightened despots as well. Frederick's despotic tendencies include greatly enlarging the Prussian army, keeping the hierarchical class structure, serfdom, and a dependence on the nobility. Frederick was severely reliant on the nobility actually, because he allowed the nobility, only the nobility, to rise to the upper ranks of his government bureaucracy. The reason Frederick the Great is considered an enlightened monarch, though, is because of his many other policies that advanced enlightened ideas. Frederick established a single code of laws that spread across all of the territories which he controlled. With this code of laws, he eliminated the use of torture, except in treason or murder cases. It also granted a limited freedom of the speech and press. Furthermore, Frederick was able to establish complete religious toleration throughout Prussia while also freeing the serfs from royal estates, but failed to abolish serfdom as a whole.
Now, I'm sure you are all familiar with the War of Austrian Succession that occurred from 1740 to 1748. When Queen Maria Theresa's father, King Charles IV, was unable to produce a male heir to keep the Habsburg family in power in Austria, he signed the Pragmatic Sanction, which ensured that Maria Theresa would be able to be the legitimate ruler of Austria. When Charles IV died, the sanction was largely ignored, and Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded Austria to seize the lands of Silesia, sparking the War of Austrian Succession. He and Louis XV of France argued that according to Salic law, there could not be a female ruler. France had declared war on Austria and allied with Prussia, seeing an opportunity to end the Habsburg dynasty, while Great Britain allied with Austria. The war was not contained in Europe, though. Throughout the 8-year struggle, Britain seized the French fort in North America, and France took Madras, India, from Britain. The war was ended by the Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, which guaranteed the return of all lands except Silesia, which was taken by Prussia. Now let's take a look at what was happening in Austria at this time. Empress Maria Theresa, who reigned from 1740 to 17, stunned by the loss of Silesia to Frederick the Great and resolved to reform her empire in preparation for a possible future conflict. Maria Theresa improved the condition of the serfs by forcing the clergy and nobility to pay their property and income taxes to royal officials, who administered the districts of Austria. Her division of the Austrian territory into 10 provinces and further into districts made Austria more centralized and bureaucratic than ever before. Maria Theresa further strengthened the state through the enlarging and modernization of the military, and by making education mandatory for civil servants. Although we consider her an enlightened despot, she did not allow as many individual freedoms as the others. She was very staunchly Catholic and did not allow religious toleration.
Joseph II reigned from 1780 to 1790 and was determined to make more changes than his mother did, while still trying to strengthen the power of the Habsburg monarchy. He completely embraced the ideas of the philosophies and even said, "I have made philosophy the lawmaker of my empire. Her logical applications are going to transform Austria." Joseph's changes were drastic. He abolished serfdom and the feudal system in Austria, and even gave the serfs hereditary rights to their property. He instituted a new penal code that abolished the death penalty and established the principle of equality of all before the law. Joseph introduced overwhelming religious reforms as well. He allowed complete religious toleration and limited the power of the Catholic Church in Austria. He went even further by eliminating all internal trade barriers and monopolies within Austria to allow economic freedom. Altogether, Joseph II issued 6,000 decrees and 11,000 laws in his effort to transform his empire. Although he had good intentions, though, Joseph's reform programs proved overwhelming. He alienated the nobility by freeing the serfs, alienated all noble non-Germans by instituting German as the national language, and even alienated the church by limiting its power. The serfs, too, were unhappy because of how quickly their lives changed because of Joseph's policies. Unfortunately, Joseph died with little success or popularity.
Next, let's talk about Russia. Catherine the Great is known to be the least enlightened ruler of the three we've mentioned. She rules from 1762 to present day, but I have a feeling she will die in 1796. Catherine gained her power after her husband, Peter III, was murdered by nobles. Yeah, I know. She recognized the ideas of the Enlightenment, but was not as passionate about enforcing its policies. Catherine initially wanted to reform Russia, but knew that she needed to keep the nobles on her side, so she was very hesitant to make reforms that may harm the nobles.
Smart.
Most of her policies were made to better the land-holding class at the expense of all others. She initially questioned the morality of serfdom, torture, and capital punishment, but she implemented very little change. To keep the nobles happy, Catherine gave many special privileges, such as exemption from taxes and a right to trial by peers for the nobility. These privileges were formalized by her Charter of the Nobility that was created 5 years ago in 1785. She is still considered a worthy ruler of Russia currently because she has been able to successfully expand Russia's territory.
Remember when we mentioned that Maria Theresa resolved to rebuild her nation in preparation for an inevitable war following the War of Austrian Succession?
Yeah, I do.
Well, the war did indeed happen, and it has become known as the 7 Years' War because, well, you guessed it, it lasted 7 years. At the end of the War of Austrian Succession, Maria Theresa was furious because Silesia was not returned to her Austrian Empire. She worked with her foreign minister, Count Wenzel von Kunitz.
That's a mouthful.
Yes, it is. In an attempt to separate Prussia from its ally France, but unexpected alliances were made. France and Russia sided with Austria, while Britain sided with Prussia. The war was so important because up until now, it is the only global war to have occurred. There were three major areas of battle: Europe, India, and North America. Most of the major battles that occurred took place in North America, and those battles collectively became known as the French and Indian War, where the competition between Britain and France became extremely violent. France was initially successful, but Britain managed to come out on top with the help of William Pitt the Elder, who decided to focus Britain's attention on the war in North America and not the one in Europe. Britain had, and still does, the most powerful navy in all of Europe, which gave them a great advantage during the French and Indian War and enabled them to defeat the French fleets. In 1758, Forts Louisbourg and Duquesne had been captured, and in 1759, the British were able to seize Montreal, the Great Lakes, and the Ohio Valley. The war between France and Britain was ended by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which gave Britain French Canada, the lands east of the Mississippi, India, and Spanish Florida. By 1763, Britain had become the world's greatest colonial power. The war was ended in Europe with the Peace of Hubertsburg, which returned all occupied territories to the original owners except Silesia, which remained under the permanent control of Prussia.
The 18th century has been characterized by changes in social practices and conditions that were for a long time European traditions. These social changes have been brought about mainly by the Agricultural Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution was an advancement in agricultural practices that resulted in increased crop yields and the better transportation and preservation of foods. The revolution has been characterized by 4 factors, which are more farmland, increased yields per acre, healthier livestock, and an improved climate. While our quest for food was solved, we have been able to focus on social issues. In the past century, the practice of primogeniture, favoring the eldest son the most, has begun to become a thing of the past. But unfortunately, some parents still resort to infanticide in times of economic hardship. You may have also noticed that marriages have started to occur later in people's lives, and fewer marriages are arranged by parents, simply trying to form relationships and climb the social ladder. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So thank you for watching our recap of the past 75 years of European history. I'm Savannah Good.
And I'm Jared Lanier.
And we're signing off.